In our lifetimes, all of us will experience suffering and pain, and it affects all of us differently. Through bereavement, betrayal, illness and injury, our lives can change in the blink of an eye, and sometimes it feels like there's just wave after wave of bad things happening to us. Sometimes our situation may not seem that serious to others, but to us the pain is just so intense. People may offer words of help, but often their kind intentions only increase the pain. Everything happens for a reason, they might say. Or your loved one has been taken so they can be in a happier place. Or maybe God is teaching you a lesson here. All such advice is ultimately inadequate and is used to defend God. Bad could be made good. Pain can become privilege. If we see God as a loving parent who controls every aspect of our life, then perhaps we might draw some comfort. But we're more likely to ask, how could God do this to me? But perhaps that question is the wrong one to ask. Could it be that God is not the cause of our suffering? A good place to consider this is the story of Job. Job was a righteous, wealthy family man when all of a sudden his world starts caving in. He loses all his wealth and all of his family die. The story continues with dialogue between his friends who come to comfort him. And at first they do, but then they turn on Job. They think he's done something wrong. He is not so righteous after all. All the while Job protests his innocence. Eventually God shows up in the story, but instead of offering an explanation, God asks a barrage of questions. Do you give the horse its might? Who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? Have you commanded the morning since your days began? Then God asks, can you pull in a leviathan with a fish hook? Or tie down its tongue with a rope? Can you put a cord through its nose, or pierce its jaw with a hook? Well, I'm thinking how difficult it must be to keep the planet spinning. After all, the Leviathan didn't go down without a fight. I imagine God saying, do you think you can do a better job? Maybe God wills his people to live contented lives, but the chaos and cruelty of the world prevents us from being free of suffering. In such a world, one thing is for sure, everything doesn't happen for a reason. And our question changes from, God, why are you doing this to me? To, God, you know what I am going through. Help me. Solidarity may be found in the Psalms. We learn to use the Psalms to turn to God, not in anger or self-pity, but to be comforted and restored. As well as offering a resource for prayer and praise, the Psalms provide valuable tools in coping with grief and despair. Take Psalm 109, for instance, going on a journey of pain that asks the question, why me? But ends with a cry for support, help me, according to your steadfast love. Psalm 137 is another example, a lament tied to the exile in Babylon. The Israelites are in a foreign land. Chaos reigns all around them. Their plight is beyond hope in human terms. So the psalmist names the pain and hands it over to God. Finally, there is Psalm 88, known as the mother of all laments. There is no enemy in sight, just references to darkness and the pit. This is the prayer of someone at death's door, and they may have been knocking at it for some time. Yet, the psalmist puts his trust in God, the God who saves and refuses to turn away. The suffering psalms have one common feature. The prayers must go somewhere. When we are at our wits' end, giving our anger and frustration and helplessness up to God might be the most helpful thing we could do. Jesus prayed these psalms of desolation too. On the cross he recalled Psalm 2 when he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And it is to Jesus that we turn our attentions now. The classical viewpoint throughout history paints the picture of a God who cannot suffer. Stability was seen as a virtue. But in recent century, there's been popular acceptance of a God that suffers with us. And Jesus, the Son of God, the suffering servant, who came down to live as a human, gives us a gateway to understand that God can share in our own sufferings. At the core of Christianity, writes the German theologian Jürgen Moltmann, we find the history of the God who humiliated himself, who became a man, who took upon himself the suffering of inhumanity, and who died in the God abandonment of the cross. The cross reveals the heart of God who suffers with his people. And so our pain and suffering can be shared with God at the foot of the cross. After Jesus ascended to heaven, the Holy Spirit was sent as the comforter for God's people to draw strength from. Paul's letters in the New Testament signpost us to this help through the Spirit. The Spirit helps us in our weakness, it says in Romans 8. Elsewhere, when Paul is in prison, he writes to the Philippians, "It was kind of you to share in my troubles." This highlights a really important source of strength, sharing in the suffering of one another. This doesn't mean solving all of the problems of another's pain. The American pastor Tim Keller says, suffering people need to be able to weep and pour out their hearts and not immediately be shut down by being told what to do. That's where Job's friends got it so wrong. Christians are called to bear one another's burdens, to take one another's hands in the darkness of our time, to walk together through the rubbish with hope for light along the way. I remember talking with a wise priest on this bench who told me that the older he gets, the more questions he has. There are no answers to some of our deepest questions about suffering, but there can be a response. That might come through Job, or the Psalms, or the cross, or through each other. Whatever it might be, I hope it will be something to help you get through this and to a happier place.